The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. I am going to talk a bunch today about what's going on in Venezuela. And talking about this issue at all is sort of a Pyrrhic victory because there's a contingent of the left that is getting Venezuela just very wrong. And when I talk about it, I feel like I'm doing the right thing in the sense that it's important to point out when the left goes wrong. But these stories get relatively little traffic, and they do anger a bunch of people in the audience, and they even sometimes get people to cancel memberships because people get mad at me over what they see as me getting the stories wrong. But it just would not feel right to ignore the Venezuela story right now. Ignoring it would be a missed opportunity to talk about some really serious geopolitical issues. Even if there are people in my core audience that just flat out disagree with me, I know every time I talk about this, some people do actually say, you know what? There is a bunch of nonsense going on with this issue on the left. And some people actually do come around and change their mind. So I think that in the long term, it is worth it for me to keep talking about this. And that's why I'm just going to jump right into it today. We had this questionably valid re-election of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And after that, the General Assembly leader, Juan Guaidó, was established as interim president with the idea, as provided by the Venezuelan Constitution, that if there is an election that is perceived to be invalid, the General Assembly can appoint an interim president, and that interim president is to oversee elections that are ideally more fair or fair compared to the ones that started the entire problem to begin with. I said when we started talking about this a week or 10 days ago that what ultimately happens is going to be hugely determined by whether the military stays with Nicolas Maduro or abandons Maduro. And we actually have some news about that, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about first here is flat out how there are a lot of people on the left that are just missing the boat on the foundations of this story. There are too many leftists in the United States and in some other countries who are supporting Nicolas Maduro, but for different reasons. Some on the left are supporting Maduro because they've fallen for his faux progressive rhetoric. This is sort of like the most romantic reason to support Nicolas Maduro. And many of them also before Maduro were equally taken with Hugo Chavez, both of whom spouted very progressive sounding sort of utopian socialistic stuff. But the truth is that they are authoritarians who subjugate the basic democratic institutions, elections, the press, the judiciary, and others for their own gain. They are running kleptocracies, in effect. That's one piece of the left that supports Maduro. Another piece of the left that supports Maduro does it because they believe to differing degrees that the Venezuelan opposition to Chavez and Maduro has from the beginning been American neocon-funded astroturf, maybe tied in with getting oil from Venezuela. Now, we could do an entire hour just on that, which I know most of the audience doesn't want, although maybe I'll do a live stream in more detail about just this issue. But here is why the left is misguided on this and really needs to get it together. The right is already using Venezuelan so-called socialism to attack the left, okay, to attack actual socialism, to attack social democracy. These are bad faith criticisms from the right. And James Bloodworth points this out really well in his latest piece for Foreign Policy, which you should read. So the right is, of course, going after the Maduro regime in a way that is advantageous to their worldview. So that then what happens is when the left simply defends the regime, we end up losing even bigger because the left is making the mistake of believing that they are simply opposing American imperialism, or they're simply supporting these utopian socialistic ideas by standing by Nicolas Maduro and the regime. But what they are doing, in effect, no matter what they envision themselves to be doing, is defending a brutal authoritarian. Even if you say they're not actually defending Maduro. It's that they're just so opposed to American imperialism or to wars for oil or whatever. The modern left still loses when we defend Nicolas Maduro. And this is where we get to that term that I've been using for a little while now, the Leninist left. There is an American left that is focused on anti-imperialism, particularly against the U.S. empire, and they end up supporting all sorts of de facto dictators. U.S.-led regime change around the world, and in particular in Latin America, has been a disaster. It's a huge red flag when we see the American neocon establishment want to get involved in Latin America. I completely agree with you. American military involvement in replacing Maduro in Venezuela could be absolutely disastrous. But does that mean that the American left should again take the side of the people that are effectively the domestic imperialists, the Maduro-Chavez regime? Nicolas Maduro domestically is doing many of the things that the Leninist left claims to be opposed to the U.S. doing around the world. I can't support that, and I hope that you don't either. Even if there are other countries supporting opposition groups in Venezuela, that doesn't change that in Venezuela there are tons of people who oppose the destructive Maduro regime who are protesting for real at huge risk to their lives. Now, the left will come in and say, well, but hold on, it's an American-led coup. Hold on a second. Maduro has destroyed fair elections. Maduro has eliminated all sorts of checks and balances. You've got elements of the left doing the exact same thing with Assad in Syria, and then they will come in and say it's all for oil because Trump simply wants their oil. Trump may want their oil. I, quite frankly, don't think Trump really understands much about the situation there. But the oil companies aren't hugely into American military intervention in Venezuela. They're pretty happy with the status quo, getting to refine the low-quality crude oil from Venezuela, making money off of it. So the idea that there's this sort of united front of the United States government and oil companies to take Venezuelan oil and upend the status quo, that's simply not true. You can agree or disagree with one or both, but it's not a cut and dry position that the U.S. government and oil companies have a particular plan that they're all in agreement with for Venezuelan oil. So that's also not a good argument. So where I end up is the same place as a week ago, which is that I'm a progressive. I do not support any of these authoritarians. I, at the same time, am against American neoconservative interventions, and I am afraid that Trump will get involved. That doesn't mean that I support either implicitly or explicitly Nicolas Maduro. Maduro and Chavez before him were kleptocrats, just like Trump, who governed for themselves, except that Maduro and Chavez did and do enough redistribution and rhetoric that sounds populist, that allows them to keep some popularity and retain power. It's not for me. Let's oppose leaders who should be opposed, and let's vote for people in the United States who won't do the types of interventions in Latin America that we're against. We don't need to stand by Maduro because we think maybe Trump is interested in Venezuelan oil. Okay, so now let's talk about something more tangible in Venezuela. When Juan Guaidó first entered the conversation as interim president, despite Nicolas Maduro claiming that he was legitimately reelected in Venezuela, we asked, what's going to happen next? Who's going to prevail here? And as I said at the time, it's really going to be influenced by the military, because in these, it's very common historically that when you have these authoritarian types like Nicolas Maduro, that they have the support of the military, at least for some period of time. And when there is an attempt to actually have some kind of real democracy or fair elections or whatever other method of accountability is tried to be put in place, it will often come down to the military. If the military stays behind Maduro, it's likely Maduro will retain control. If the military starts to split or abandon Maduro, it becomes more likely that Guaidó will prevail as interim president and that hopefully new elections will be held. We now have some high-profile military defections to tell you about. The first is General Francisco Esteban Yanez Rodriguez, who is disavowing what he calls the dictatorial authority of Nicolas Maduro and is recognizing Juan Guaidó as the interim president. He put out a video, which we're showing to our TV and YouTube audience, in military uniform. He's identified as the director of strategic planning in the high command of the Venezuelan Air Force. That matches how he's identified on the Air Force website. So that all checks out. And this is the highest ranking military defection so far. There have been some lower ranking defections as well, which maybe we'll talk about later in the week. The general says that the military should stop defending Maduro, that if they're afraid of internal threats from the military, then they should simply stay at home. The general also says that Maduro has airplanes ready to go to flee if it gets to that point. And of course, the general hopes that it does. And this is absolutely huge because the way that these authoritarian autocrats stay in power, especially in Latin American history, and as many of you know, I'm from Argentina. We've had dictatorships in Argentina, the most recent one ending right around the time that I was born. These individuals, these authoritarian autocrats, retain control when they have the support of the military. Once you don't, things start to crumble. Now, is there precedent for authoritarian dictators to leave what we would call somewhat peacefully? There are. So the Shah of Iran left in 1979 and died in exile in Egypt. Now, it didn't work out super well because then the Islamic Republic was declared. But at least the Shah did leave without starting, by definition, a sort of bloody war. And so it is with precedent. Maybe Nicolas Maduro is being pushed closer and closer to that. In Ethiopia, Miriam fled the country when it was clear he wasn't going to win, was promised asylum by Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Idi Amin went to Saudi Arabia until his death. So there are examples of this. Now, in Iran, again, what's particularly depressing is that the people mostly did want democracy, the way that I believe the Venezuelan people also want democracy. But the Islamic Republic came out on top, and that's a reality. So that's when it circles back to the geopolitics. Well, Trump wants this, and Macron is on this side, and the Argentinian president is on that side. Let's first evaluate whether Maduro deserves our support. Then let's figure out, are we electing people in the U.S. that are going to intervene in ways we don't want and deal with that? And then, of course, we have to be aware of the reality that just because you remove someone who shouldn't be there or someone who shouldn't be there is pushed out by the public, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a replacement that you like. And Iran is a really, really good example of that. Where might Maduro go? Some say Bolivia, although I read one interesting piece that says it's not going to be Bolivia. Nicaragua has been mentioned. Cuba has been mentioned, although that's almost more complicated for Cuba, which does seem to want to continue to improve relations with the United States. The more likely Maduro is to have an idea of where he could go and never face consequences, the more likely it is that he might leave power peacefully. And that is, of course, what we should all be hoping for the sake of the Venezuelan people. Let me know where you are on this issue. I know you will. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is not only a member, but also a former guest on the show. It's Matthew Ho, who I really appreciate being a David Pakman Show member. Also want to say thanks to Thomas Isbell, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. We did have this just crazy birthday membership special over the weekend. If you didn't get the newsletter with the coupon code and you're interested in just an obscenely outrageous membership discount, get in touch using the contact form at davidpakman.com. One of the issues that elected officials pay lip service to is nuclear proliferation. And the idea is they all pretend to want to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that are out there and prevent the use of nuclear weapons, all of that stuff. I'm sure you've been hearing it for as long as you've been paying attention to politics. But it's not super straightforward. It's not just as straightforward as fewer weapons for all, because some countries, including the United States, already have a ton of nukes. Some other countries also have a lot of nukes. Many countries have no nukes whatsoever. So anytime that the United States takes a position on nukes, you have to understand the context and you have to know the geopolitics to really get it. So this gets us to Friday. And on Friday, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, announced that the United States is going to suspend the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is a deal between the United States and, of course, Russia from 1987, which was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. It eliminated a ton of land-based ballistic and cruise missiles and their launchers, with particular ranges. And the underpinnings of this entire elimination of the treaty are really Orwellian in nature. If you just casually heard about this, you would think, oh, there's a deal limiting the weapons that Russia can produce. So if we suspend the deal, now Russia is free to produce more weapons, as would be the United States. What the Trump administration says is that Russia has been ignoring the deal anyway for a long time, so that they're going to get tough on Russia by suspending the deal so that the United States can also now produce more of these weapons to be big and tough against Russia like Trump wants to be seen as being. Big deal, right? We're not going to let Russia win on this one, so we're going to suspend the deal. And now Russia has 180 days to return to compliance or the deal goes entirely dead. Here are all the things that you have to understand about this, because it's way more complex and insidious. First of all, remember who has nukes, right? We're putting up on the screen a list of nuclear warheads by country. And you'll see that both Russia and the United States have more than 6,000 each. France has 300 and China has 260. The UK has 215. Pakistan, India, Montenegro, North Korea, Israel have a range of numbers based on estimates. So as you can see, the United States and Russia already have way more nukes than would ever be needed to blow the world up many, many times over. So this isn't literally about, oh, Russia builds a little capacity, so we need to get out of the deal so that we can build a little more capacity. Because neither Russia nor the United States need any more capacity. This is optics. It's the possibility of using this for other purposes. What might those other purposes be of suspending this deal? Well, the United States has already said they'd be open to negotiations on this. They didn't say with who, except we know that it's a deal with Russia only. So that's the only other party that the United States would be negotiating with on this. So this could create a pretext for a much bigger negotiation with Russia about all sorts of stuff that would again be an opportunity for Trump to concede who knows what to Vladimir Putin. So then that gets us to evaluating the process here. Is it logical if what we really want is Russia to simply comply with the agreement? Would we go directly to suspending the deal? No. Much more logical would be, before you say we're suspending the deal, you would threaten to increase sanctions on Russia, then you would increase sanctions on Russia, then you would threaten to drop the treaty, then you would actually announce that you're starting the 180-day period to end the treaty. But instead, we've seen the Trump administration simply say, we are going to drop the deal. We are also, by the way, they've been dropping sanctions on Russia as well. Now, they'll tell you, of course, oh, in some particular cases, we added some new sanctions. But those pale compared to the sanctions that have been dropped. So then we have to really question the goal here, because there's no downside for Russia if the United States backs out of the treaty. Yes, we can also now start to build more of these mid-range weapons. But who cares? We both already have thousands of nukes. And once you game this out fully, considering that we're skipping sanctions, the possible outcomes are this just means both sides keep scaling up, making nuclear war more likely mathematically, or Putin and Trump meet to, quote, negotiate, which is never good for us since Trump is such a disastrous negotiator. And in any case, it's all upside for Russia. It's absolutely pathetic. And a lot of people are completely missing the boat on this one. The American right has been very successful at putting American social democrats in this corner by accusing them of wanting ridiculously high tax rates. And they've actually been successful at doing this with a lot of different issues. So, for example, with abortion, the right says abortion's murder, we're against it. The left wants abortion no matter what. Obviously, that's not true. The left wants safe, legal abortion up to a certain point, depending on the health of the mother. There's a bunch of different nuance in there. The right is for lower taxes, lower them as much as possible because, hey, it's my money. For the most part, the left is about nuanced, dialed in tax policies that make sense and are defended by research, not just take everybody's money. So when Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed this 70% marginal tax rate, we looked at it very carefully. And first of all, we explained marginal tax rates. We explained it's not 70% of everyone's money, it's 70% on income above a certain level. It might be above 5 million in earnings. Others have floated 10 million in earnings. Then we looked at, is there historical precedent for such a level of taxation? And the answer is yes, there is, even in the United States. Then we looked at, what does the research say about top marginal tax rates? And we found that there's actually lots of research which says that the rate that maximizes government revenue is a top marginal tax rate of somewhere 70, 73%, according to an MIT study. And that assumes that you start that top rate at a certain level of income, maybe 5 million, maybe 10 million, who knows? Okay. In comes new Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who was interviewed recently, who is going a step further. She wants not a 70% top tax rate, but she is floating the idea of a 90% top tax rate to start with for the 1%. Now, what doesn't make sense about that? A 90% marginal rate for the 1%. Think about that for a second. We'll watch her explain it, and then we'll dig into it. Take a look.
So there are a few things that we can do. One of them is that we could increase the taxes that people are paying who are the extremely wealthy in our community. So 70%, 80%, we've had it as high as 90%. The other thing that we can do is we can tax corporations or have them level out the gap that exists with their workers. I'm also one that really looks at the defense budget that we have. That has increased nearly 50% since 9/11. And so most of the money that we have in there is much more than we spend on education, on healthcare.
Yes, I mean, I think what picks up for a lot of people is taxing the rich up to 80, 90% or 70.
Yeah.
And,
the 1% must pay their fair share.
Yeah. So the thing there is the 1% must pay tax rates up to 90%. I believe that this is simply bad policy informed by, or maybe better said, uninformed by a real knowledge of the facts. And I'll tell you exactly what I'm talking about. In 2018, to be in the top 1% of the United States, you needed to earn $421,000. Okay, $421,000 puts you in the top 1%. So the suggestion here implicitly is that she would at least consider a policy where once you get to the top 1% or earnings of $421,000, you start to pay as much as 90% tax on income above that. Now, remember, many states have income taxes, like, for example, Massachusetts of 5.3%. So under that idea, if you live in Massachusetts and make over $421,000, you pay 95.3% marginal tax rate on all of your income above that threshold. Now, I know the defenses people are going to send to me, David, she was spitballing 70, 80, or 90%. She didn't mean just the 1%. Maybe the tax brackets are different. I believe that this is a mistake both in spirit and by the letter. And I'm willing to be led here by the peer-reviewed research on this issue. I have not seen evidence that starting a 90% marginal tax bracket at $421,000 is what we need to be doing. Now, there will be people who say, David, hold on. There's precedent during the Eisenhower era, 91% marginal tax rate. Well, yes and no. In 1950, it's true that there was a 91% marginal tax rate on incomes over $200,000. Number one, that's equivalent to 2 million today, not the 1%, right? Not 421,000, 2 million inflation adjusted. That's just a fraction of the top 1%. You're not in the 1% today if you earn 2 million. You're way, way, way above that. But the more important thing is that that 91% marginal tax rate during the Eisenhower era was combined with a bunch of other rules that exempted a lot of income from the 91% rate. So the effective tax rates for a lot of people were actually lower than they are today, even in high tax brackets, because a lot of those exemptions. So my challenge to Ilhan Omar is explain to me the data behind a 90% marginal tax rate on incomes in the 1%, meaning starting at $421,000. What I would support, once again, is what I've seen backed by research and data, which is we need higher tax brackets. Right now, the highest bracket starts at, I think it's $510,000 or $520,000. We need higher brackets. I don't know if there needs to be a bracket at $1 million and 5 and 10 million or what it needs to be. We need higher brackets. I've seen no data that 90% is the right number for that top marginal tax rate. I've seen no data that we should be trying to collect that rate from people in the $400,000 income range. So what I would support is a system that's progressive with a high marginal rate around 70% for the top of that 1% and scaling up from the, I believe it's 37% top rate now, up to that 70%. The problem with this idea is that it allows the right to caricature the left. 70% marginal on 5 million, totally defensible academically, totally defensible economically, totally defensible historically. 90% tax rate, starting on incomes at $421,000, that is not to the, based on all of the research I've been doing on this issue for years, the policy that we should be pursuing. And I also think it's a strategic mistake because now the right is going to seize on this and they'll go to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and they'll say, do you disagree with your colleague who's talking about 90% tax on the 1%? Or is the problem actually the super rich and should we be doing 70%? And now AOC will have to say, no, my colleague was right in spirit, but we might have different, just no. This is not ideological. We actually have an opportunity here with the new progressive movement in the Democratic Party in the House to get united on some of these key issues, inequality being one of them, and having Ilhan Omar say, maybe 90% because the 1% need to pay. It's a mistake. It's not backed by data that I've seen, and it's only going to muddy the waters. Let's be clear on what the policy should be. And I don't believe that this is the policy that we should actually be pursuing on the left. If you disagree with me, let me know. I am, of course, on Instagram at david.pacman. The show is on Instagram at David Pacman Show. Follow both of us there.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Bethany Lacina, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Rochester. She is an expert on ethnic conflict and war. And today we are going to talk about how to even get into this topic, Bethany. I mean, I guess for your information, last week I interviewed former NFL running back Arian Foster, who's no longer in the NFL, but was very involved with a lot of the players who participated in the kneeling national anthem protests that became both a political and social and pop culture issue for a period of time. Now that we've gotten like a little bit of distance from the start of that incident, are we able to start analyzing what the impact was of those protests in terms of the players and the audience and the NFL?
Yeah, I think the moment when the impact was largest has probably happened. And now we'll see kind of how the effects fade, if they fade, if additional complications happen, and so on.
So let's maybe start with the effect on people watching football, right? In terms of, did this dissuade people overall? And then we would, of course, have to break it down and see how many people were more interested in football as a result of these protests. But what do we know about in the net, what the effect was on the football audience from the protests?
So we know a lot of people told pollsters they were angry at the NFL. And something like there was something like a 10 to 15% drop in the number of Republicans and independents who said they were NFL fans. And we know that around the same time, the NFL was taking a ratings hit. It is a relatively cheap thing to do to tell a poll, or easy thing to do to tell a pollster, oh yeah, I'm not watching the NFL anymore. How many people really stuck with that is hard to know. The year-over-year decline in watching the NFL has all kinds of problems. People who dislike the way the rules have changed the gameplay and so forth, and the decline of cable is the biggest thing. So it's too strong to say that the whole ratings hit that the NFL took was because of the protests.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, Donald Trump, at the time, Donald Trump was taking advantage in his tweets of the fact that the NFL had been experiencing a ratings decline for some period of time, even before this incident. He was very conveniently attributing it to people angry about the kneeling protest, but we do sort of have to balance this against the fact that there has been a decline in NFL ratings more generally as well, don't we?
Yes, and the NFL also has nowhere to go but down. It's insanely popular. So the taking a modest hit means still being insanely popular. So it's been declining slightly from an astronomical peak.
So let's now get into some of the racial divisions that have become clear based on the data when it comes to the NFL in terms of perceptions not only by white and non-white fans, but of white and non-white players. What's sort of the best entry point to start talking about what the data suggests there?
Well, we've known for a while that white and Black Americans have very different views about whether the protests were appropriate. And we've known that there's a kind of diffuse anger at the NFL as a brand. But what I was curious about is, how does this translate into how people are really relating to the product on the field, which is ultimately the players? And how are they feeling about the players when they're not being asked a question that sort of prompts them to think about the anthem protests, in light of not kind of reminding them that this is something that's going on. So what I've been looking at is consumer data that's been collected for years, not because of the protests or anything else, but because companies want to pick celebrities as spokespeople, and looking at just has the popularity of the players changed when people are not thinking about the anthem protests in particular, just being asked, how do you feel about this guy versus that guy?
And when you did that, what did you find?
There are 43 people who marketers have been tracking from 2015, before the protests started, to 2018, the most recent data we have. And you can look at how did the comparisons between these exact same people change. And what you find is that in this group of 43, all of the people who participated in the protests are Black. The popularity of Black protesting players fell in the general population, and particularly with whites. But But the most important finding is that among whites without a college education, who are kind of the base of the conservative part of America, Black players lost popularity relative to white players, even if they weren't protesters. So there was a kind of increase in resentment of Black players in general among the most conservative part of the population.
Okay, so let's see if we can sort of summarize that in a sense. Players who are Black are now less popular compared to before the protests started. But even the players who didn't participate in the protests but are Black also were affected by this decline in popularity.
Yes, right.
And is it fair to say that that is particularly marked with white viewers of the NFL?
Oh, yes. Or at least with whites in general. Viewers of the NFL is tricky since now people are, telling pollsters, oh, I don't watch the NFL.
Right.
But among Black Americans, there's essentially no change in how they feel about these NFL stars. There's maybe a slight uptick in popularity for Colin Kaepernick in particular, but Black Americans just are kind of holding steady in their ratings of these players, and white Americans are reacting negatively to the protests, and then by extension, feeling resentment of some Black players just in general.
How about with regard to white players? So has the perception by either white or non-white people, voters, call them voters or NFL viewers, whatever you want to call them, has their perception of favorability towards white players changed before and after the kneeling protests?
Ironically, it's actually easier to know how people are changing relative to each other than to know how they're changing in absolute terms. For the following reason, the marketers who collect this data are not they're only interested in popular people. So if somebody's popularity really plummets, they just get dropped from the survey. So how people feel about all white players in general is harder to suss out than to know that, okay, for these 20 white players, their popularity has held steady or gone up relative to these specific Black players. So
and can we say that? I mean, is there this cohort of white players who seem to have been unaffected by these popularity shifts as a result or during the protests?
So all the 20-ish, I think there are 21 white players in the data. They're the stars of the NFL, and their popularity, some of them ticked up a little, some of them ticked down a little. They obviously have been doing better and worse on the field, but as a group, their popularity has not been hit.
So last week when I spoke to former running back Arian Foster, he said that there were, his perception, and this was not a scientific study, but his perception as someone in the NFL was that the overwhelming majority of the Black players felt strongly in favor of the protests when they were going on. But many said they are not going to get involved. They are going to stay silent because they saw their involvement as a potential liability, a liability that could be related to their relationship with the owners and management of the teams, potentially in terms of their relationship with the NFL, but also with how they are perceived with fans. It sounds like they were correctly assessing that there would have been consequences on the basis of the data you're discussing here.
Yeah, there's no question. And this this marketing data has real consequences for people. There are millions of dollars in endorsements and licensing. that turn on polling like this. You know, how popular is this guy? Who do I want to sell my cereal? And the choice to protest cost people. And then it's also true that Black players took a hit to a certain extent, regardless of their choice.
Right. We see that even those not participating were negatively affected. So can you explain that in a little? Can you explain that in a little more detail? So there's this thing called a Q score, which is kind of like a popularity score given by fans to players. What are the ways in which that translates into money for the players? I mean, it's obvious if you're more popular, you'll be more in demand for endorsements. But what are some of the other ways?
I think the owners would claim that that decisions about actually being on a team are not tied to popularity. Though at the margin, wanting more popular players makes sense. I think, though, people have documented that just in general, there's tons of little ways in which Black athletes get presented to the public differently. They get different media coverage. They get scouting reports that emphasize that they're great athletes as opposed to being intelligent. There's just a kind of accumulation of little dings that add up to less money in endorsements and licenses while you're a player, and then less money for your autobiography, less speaking fees down the road, less likely to get tapped to be a talking head on a sports program. The kind of lifetime earnings of an NFL player are not just about playing the game, they're also about just being liked by the fans. And there are lots of little ways in which Black players have a tougher road there.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when the average career is so short, so much of it is what is it that is available to you after you are not playing anymore. We've been speaking with Bethany Lacina, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Rochester. Bethany, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Sure, my pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So it's come to my attention that Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand how the federal debt and federal budget deficit work, which probably won't surprise a lot of people in our audience. You might remember, or you might not, that a while ago it really wasn't clear whether Trump understood the difference between health insurance and life insurance. I don't know if you remember this, but at the time we covered it. Donald Trump said to the New York Times back when he was interviewed in July of 2017, quote, "So pre-existing conditions are a tough deal because you're basically saying from the moment the insurance, you're 21 years old, you start working and you're paying $12 a year for insurance. And by the time you're 70, you get a nice plan. Here's something where you walk up and say, I want my insurance. It's a very tough deal, but it is something that we're doing a good job of." So that is a description of life insurance. What's called whole life policies accrue value over someone's lifetime. And when Trump talks about $12 a year or $1 a month, that also is confusing because that's usually the price for term life insurance, not whole life insurance, which doesn't accrue value. So it was just like completely whacked out. Trump seemed to be talking about health insurance, but he described whole life by quoting prices typically associated with term life. And the conclusion I came to was this guy doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. That gets us to this weekend. It seems that Donald Trump is confused not only about health insurance versus life insurance, but it seems he also is confused about the federal budget deficit versus the trade deficit, which is extraordinarily scary because Trump ran both on fixing the trade deficit and the budget deficit. He hasn't done either. He's actually made both worse, and he doesn't seem to know the difference between the two. This is really, really weird. 2 times late last week, Donald Trump said something that was the sort of thing that normally like an 11-year-old who's just starting middle school might say, because they're only starting to learn the basics about how the world works. Trump was asked about the federal deficit, the federal budget deficit, revenues versus expenditures, surplus versus deficit, not the trade deficit. Trump gave an answer about the trade deficit and tariffs, which has nothing to do with it. I mean, just it has absolutely nothing to do with what Trump was asked. Take a look at this.
You mentioned all the economic indicators are going up. Why then is are U.S. deficits and the national debt increasing at a time when...
Well, the trade deals won't kick in for a while. You know, number one, the USMCA hasn't even been approved yet. It has to go before Congress and get approved. Now, it should get approved quickly. NAFTA was one of the worst deals ever made. During the campaign, I said I will either terminate NAFTA or negotiate a new deal. And we negotiated a good deal. Now, if you went back to pre-NAFTA, that would be frankly okay with me, pre-NAFTA or the new deal, but I won't allow NAFTA. NAFTA was a horrible deal for this country. You look at the scars all over our country where you go to New England, you go to Ohio, you go to Pennsylvania, you see what happened in North Carolina. You have factories that are still empty from what happened with NAFTA. NAFTA was a horrible deal. The USMCA is a great deal. But pre-NAFTA we had huge surpluses with Mexico. With NAFTA, we have huge deficits. We lose $100 billion a year on trade with Mexico. Does that sound good?
So let's be super clear here. The answer has nothing to do with the question. Trump was asked about why is the federal budget deficit exploding? And he says, well, some of the tariffs haven't kicked in. USMCA, a trade deal hasn't been signed. NAFTA is a disaster, and we used to have a trade surplus with Mexico. The question was, you claim that all economic indicators are up, yet the U.S. deficit and debt are going up, which is the opposite direction we want them going. Of course, it's relevant because Trump campaigned on reducing that. And Trump says, well, the trade deficit isn't down yet because some of the deals haven't kicked in. That's not the same deficit, Donnie boy. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Why we would at this point, I don't know. But give him the benefit of the doubt. Imagine that he didn't hear the question correctly or whatever. A few hours later, he's interviewed by the New York Times, and it's the exact same nonsense again. Trump is asked whether he might keep the tariffs even if he makes a so-called good trade deal with China. And he responds, quote, yeah, sure. We have 25% now on $50 billion. And by the way, Peter, that's a lot of money pouring into our treasury, you know. We never made 5 cents with China. We're getting right now 25% on $50 billion. And then I was putting 25% at a later date, which date came and went, 25% or 200 billion. You might not have any idea what Trump is talking about there. But again, he's talking about tariffs. Trump is talking about tariffs generating money for the treasury, which figures in to the federal budget deficit. This is not how it works, okay? Tariffs are paid by American companies to Chinese companies if we want their goods for import. Now, there are, if you want to go by the letter of this, there are some customs duties that can come from tariffs, but they are very small. They're less than 1% of all of the taxes collected by the Treasury. It's basically a non-factor. The Chinese people aren't paying the tariffs. It's whoever imports the stuff from China that pays the tariffs, meaning mostly American companies. And again, Trump is talking about tariffs as if they're going to deal with his blown up federal budget deficit. There's a bunch of articles that notice this, and they wrote, it's unclear if Trump understands the budget deficit. It doesn't seem unclear to me. It seems perfectly clear that he doesn't understand the difference between the trade deficit and the budget deficit. And you would think Trump would know a lot about debt since he and his businesses have had such debt problems, but he doesn't seem to get it. And when you think back and remember, this is the guy who stared directly at a solar eclipse. Does anybody think that he is up to date on the intricacies of revenues versus expenditures? I guess not. And it's really embarrassing. And the biggest problem with this is not that, I mean, listen, it's stunning that the president doesn't understand this stuff. At this point, it's not surprising. But the way in which his followers will blindly defend him and say they were trick questions, or the transcript has been doctored, or the video is a deep fake which can't be trusted, or whatever, he just doesn't seem to get it. He doesn't seem to know the difference between life insurance and health insurance. He doesn't seem to know the difference between the budget deficit and the trade deficit. He just doesn't know. And then it's up to us to decide whether it's acceptable to have a president who doesn't know that stuff. You tell me. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You know, it's not super common that viewers write in and report their dreams to me. It's also, and I mean literally, not like their aspirations, but I mean the dreams that they had while sleeping. It's also, I think, not super common that people are dreaming about me. But here's a voicemail that it's very political, and it relates to me, and it relates to Trump, and it's a dream that somebody had. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. This is Jason from Portland. I just wanted to tell you a dream that I had last night. It was actually kind of funny. It was like I was watching your show, and you were telling us that Trump had a heart attack and that he died how he lived in front of the TV. I thought that I would just share that with you. Thanks.
Yeah. You know, I've actually thought, if ever there were to be a presidential assassination or death while the person is president, how would I report it? What would it be like? And what would it be like if it's a president whose policy I'm in favor of? What would it be like if it's a president whose policies I'm opposed to? And I don't think I could really say exactly what such a report would be like. But what I can tell you is that I have never wished death on anybody. And every death is a sad thing for the loved ones of that individual. And I don't know what it would be like if something were to happen to Donald Trump while he is president and it was time for me to report it. But in any case, my guess is it wouldn't be like this person's dream. That I think I can be pretty sure of. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about a new report about the number of jobs that will be eliminated by automation by 2030. There's actually a contrarian movement now when it comes to the automation technological unemployment issue. There's a movement that is starting to say, we really don't think it's a problem. We don't actually think that there's going to be net job loss because of technology. There's a new report from McKinsey which disagrees, and we're going to get into detail about that on today's bonus show. We will also talk about how Dr. Ronnie Jackson, the guy who claimed Trump is 6'3" and weighs 239, which no person who has ever seen a picture of Trump, I imagine, believes, he has now been named Donald Trump's chief medical advisor and assistant. Should we care about this? Is it really up to Trump who he has advising him on these issues? Or is this an issue of public concern? All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get access to the bonus show by becoming a member at www.joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/DavidPacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.